As early as October 1942, Finback Lieutenant Commander Jessie L. Hull found good hunting in the Formosa Channel. On the 14th, she saw 7,000-ton transport Taisan Maru steaming in convoy, signal flags flying merrily, and with one torpedo sent crew and passengers scrambling into lifeboats and the ship to the bottom. A week later, she chased a convoy at night, attacking on the surface. There was the too familiar sight of torpedoes, running under the target and failing to explode, but Hull kept right on doling out warheads until he got 2 ships, totaling 15,000 tons. And on her way back to Midway, Finback polished off a sampan with gunfire. Trigger Lieutenant Commander Roy S. Benson was on her second war patrol not far from Tokyo Bay, one dull grey morning in October, when through the murky haze a thin finger of smoke took form. Benson moved in for a look-see which convinced him that the target was a freighter too small to warrant the expenditure of a torpedo, so manned his deck gun and automatic weapons. No sooner had Trigger opened fire than the enemy replied in kind, and shells whistled all around the exposed gun crew. A sub is no match for that sort of thing, so Benson sent his gun crews below and manoeuvred to fire a torpedo. But the enemy had an answer for that too, and came charging in like a wounded whale. By adroit twisting, Trigger avoided the deadly prow, passing the Maru at a close 50 feet while machine gun bullets rained down. Trigger kicked the Japanese in the groin with a stern tube shot and then submerged. A few minutes later, she surfaced, and this time an enemy torpedo whizzed down the port side. The duel went on until after daylight, with torpedoes and depth charges. Benson finally lost touch, and we have never learned whether this little freighter was a Q-ship or a converted gunboat. Anyway, she escaped. At dusk, the 17th of October, Trigger, after sending 5,800-ton Holland Maru to the bottom and missing another close shot, was lying on the surface enjoying the night air when a Japanese destroyer charged in to ram, guns firing and depth charges ready. Trigger discreetly submerged and danced a grim ballet with the depth charges. Each time the enemy approached, the sub would sheer off, but the ash cans fell jarringly near. Finally, Trigger turned bow to the Japanese and let fly 3 torpedoes, a down-the-throat shot. At least one of these made a premature explosion and none hit. The Japanese then tried a torpedo on Trigger, but the sub came back with another at him. Reinforcements now churned the water on all sides, so Trigger went deep. This gave the destroyer the initiative, and charge after charge went off close aboard the sub, while her crew bailed water from wet to dry bilges. Just when the enemy really had the submarine cold, he did what so many of his fellows were prone to do. He gave up. Trigger lay low with run-down batteries until after midnight, then surfaced and hightailed away. She returned to Pearl Harbor with empty torpedo tubes. The sea lanes from Japan south to Truk and thence on to the South Pacific were the logistic link between the homeland and the front. Here the Central Pacific boats might strike telling blows at shipping and, at the same time, indirectly support fleet operations. So additional boats were assigned as marauders in the Carolines over and above the Australia, Pearl Harbor transfer patrols. It was a tough assignment because ships here had more and better air and surface escorts than elsewhere, and the glassy seas of low latitudes made concealment difficult. Greenling, on the Truk-Japan route when the Marines landed at Guadalcanal, made 5 attacks. She nailed the 12 700-ton Brazil Maru with 400 soldiers and 200 other passengers on board, as a survivor taken prisoner stated, and also a 4,500-ton passenger vessel, by surface attacks during darkness. Flying Fish in late August had the chance of a lifetime when a battleship showed up in her periscope sights, but she failed to hit, and the subsequent depth charge attack sent men reeling, broke crockery, knocked down insulation and damaged machinery. She escaped only by going deep to where a layer of sound-distorting cold water gave protection long enough for her to escape and retire to Pearl. The landings on Guadalcanal helped the Japanese merchant marine through the latter half of 1942 because Admiral Nimitz reluctantly transferred a dozen boats to the Bismarck-Solomons area, leaving only about 11 to patrol Empire waters, and of these 5 were usually in transit. Boats operating off Japan or China had more targets than they could handle. Greenling, on a business-like patrol in October, sank 20,000 tons of Maris and claimed damage to an auxiliary carrier. Kingfish made 5 attacks, 2 terminations. Drum saw plenty of targets, but poor torpedo performance, only 4 hits out of 23 shots, cut her bag down to 1 small freighter. Nautilus, after transporting Marines to Makin, swam into the waters off Hokkaido, and despite bad weather, made 9 attacks and sank 3 ships. Her skipper was willing to fight anything, anywhere. On occasion, he brought Nautilus to the surface where her 6-inch guns could follow up the torpedoes. Whale in October was the first American submarine to plant mines in Empire waters. These, shaped like long cylinders, were placed in torpedo tubes for discharge. Her example was followed by Sunfish, Drum, and Trigger. Rarely is the success of mining determined until after war's end, but Trigger in December was startled and pleased to see an enemy merchantman blow up in a minefield a few minutes after it had been laid. Nobody on the American side knew until late in 1945 the tremendous execution these mines had wrought. Whale received post-war credit for 5 enemy ships sunk in her minefield. Sunfish and Trigger got 2 each in theirs. All told, 16 enemy ships fell victim to offensive mines laid by American submarines before February 1943. In December, Halibut used her new SJ radar to good advantage, making numerous contacts and attacking mostly at night. She destroyed 3 small ships and somewhat revived confidence in American torpedoes by getting 9 hits out of 19 shots. Kingfish had the satisfaction of sinking a 4,400-ton Maru on Pearl Harbor Day and a larger merchantman in a radar-controlled attack 3 days after Christmas. The first and only planned lifeguard mission of 1942 was carried out by Triton, Pike, and Finback in December. These boats took station along the route to Wake Island during a bombing mission by Army B-24S. Their duties were to guide the bombers in by radio and rescue any that might be forced to ditch. It was perhaps too bad that nobody gave them an opportunity for a dramatic rescue, which might have brought maturity a year earlier to the project of submarine lifeguards. The changing pattern of submarine tactics was illustrated by Tarpon. Cruising near Tokyo Bay on the night of the 1st of February 1943, she picked up a radar contact, ran it down on the surface, and sank an 11,000-ton Maru without using her periscope. In darkness on the 8th, she picked up a radar contact, chased it on the surface, and using radar ranges and periscope sighting, put 4 hits into the 17,000-ton Tatsuta Maru. That pride of the Japanese merchant marine went to the bottom. The enemy never found an answer to these tactics, which made the American submarine one of the most formidable weapons of the war. While Tarpon was making her score, a submarine division commander at Pearl was writing a significant endorsement on a patrol report submitted by Whale. 37.5% of the torpedoes fired were defective. The case against the torpedo is well-founded. Every effort is being made to improve torpedo exploder performance, and it is hoped that the fruits of this effort will not be delayed much longer. Aleutian waters were bad enough for large ships which could stand the buffeting of the Wild Willie Wars and the pounding of heavy northern seas. For submarines, these waters were the world's worst. Unfortunately, it was the uncomfortable little S-boats that found themselves out on Uncle Sam's Arctic limb. A fair bag of big game would have been some compensation for nasty cruising, but during the whole of 1942, only 6 enemy ships took the plunge as victims of North Pacific submarines. The experience of S-34, Lieutenant Commander Thomas L. Wogan, was representative of early Aleutian patrols. She, in company with S-35, sailed from Dutch Harbour the 12th of April, bound for the Kurile Islands. The 2 boats were barely in open water when bad weather separated them. On the 2nd day of the voyage, a wave washed over the bridge of S-34 and tossed the quartermaster so savagely that his nose was half torn off and his body badly bruised. The engines were cranky and the weather foul, but a great circle track was made through the Bering Sea to reach enemy waters. On the 22nd of April, a Japanese merchantman was attacked from close range, but he dodged the fish. The captain took his boat around Kamchatka through the Kuriles into the Sea of Okhotsk, where drifting ice stopped her. 2 torpedoes from 900 yards missed an enemy freighter. That was Wogan's last contact with the enemy, except for an occasional plane. On the 27th of April, S-34 ran into another ice field. Her patrol now became a tussle with drifting ice and unpredictable currents, the barometer escalating as much as 0.15 inch an hour, and the weather changing as fast. No stars were visible, and landfalls in the foggy Kuriles were chancy. Sound gear indications were often drowned by rumblings from underwater volcanoes. Heavy seas dumped so much green water on the bridge that the conning tower hatch had to be closed even when surfaced. Below decks, everyone sniffled with colds. The only break for them came on May Day when the boat anchored for a few hours in Chichagof Harbour, Attu. During an entire watch, the men basked in fresh air and sunshine. Next day, while S-34 was at anchor in Kiska, the wind blew up a whole gale which plagued the submariners until the 10th, when they wearily returned to Dutch Harbour. So rugged a routine could be endured neither by men nor machinery, so it was decided to rotate the S-boats between the North Pacific and a relatively soft job in San Diego, acting as tame submarine for destroyers practicing anti-submarine tactics. The navigational hazards of operating an S-boat in the Aleutians claimed a victim in June, after the Japanese had occupied Attu and Kiska. S-27, commanded by Lieutenant H.L. Jukes, reconnoitred Amchitka Island for Admiral Theobald on the 19th of June. Daylight lasts for 18 hours at this time of year, so that when S-27 surfaced at 22, she hove to 5 miles offshore to recharge batteries. Fog closed in, and the submarine, without fathometer or radar, was swept by unpredictable currents onto a reef off Amchitka. The boat took a heavy list, the motor room flooded, and chlorine fumed out of a wet battery. Jukes sent out a distress call which was heard, but nobody picked up his broadcast position. As the ship was untenable, all hands went ashore in a rubber boat, carrying food, guns, and ammunition. Fortunately, on Amchitka, they found an abandoned church and other buildings where they lived fairly comfortably until rescued a week later by Catalinas from Dutch Harbour. When the Japanese invaded Kiska and Attu, the S-boats were reinforced by 7 fleet submarines to assist in patrolling cold northern waters. Growler, Lieutenant Commander Howard W. Gilmore, departed Pearl Harbor the 20th of June, called at Midway and headed north for station off Kiska. She spent 3 days watching and dodging enemy aircraft before finding worthwhile targets. In the late Arctic twilight of the 5th of July, Gilmore sighted destroyers Arar, Kasumi, and Shiranuhi off Kiska Harbour entrance. Growler crept silently up on them and methodically put a torpedo into each, then launched an extra one at Arar, who retaliated with torpedoes of her own which narrowly missed, and Growler made a quick getaway, pursued by patrol craft. She had sunk Arar and damaged the other 2 destroyers at a cost of 4 torpedoes and a jammed periscope. On the 7th of July, a Japanese destroyer with a good sound operator gave Growler a bad hour, damaging her propellers and sound gear with depth charges. But she escaped on the surface after dark, made Dutch Harbour safely, and was shifted back to Pearl and Central Pacific operations. Her crew, with radar, fathometer, efficient sound gear and air conditioning, had enjoyed a luxury cruise compared with the S-boat submariners. Triton also did good work in the Aleutians. Lieutenant Commander Kirkpatrick took her north from Pearl on the 25th of June and arrived on station off Agatu Island near Attu on the 4th of July. The skipper spent most of the holiday trying for a navigational fix, but in mid-afternoon he forgot navigation when destroyer Nenohi appeared through the mist, steaming at a cautious 9 knots. Kirkpatrick carefully fired 2 torpedoes and dove to await results. In less than a minute, a resounding explosion prompted a peek through the periscope. The delighted submariners watched Nenohi roll over, 100 men still clinging to her cold and slimy bottom. 20 minutes later, she sank, leaving her crew to fight for places in a single lifeboat. To add to Triton's joy, the fog lifted enough for Kirkpatrick to correct an 8-mile error in his dead reckoning. He hung about until the 12th of July, when periscope trouble developed, and then proceeded to Dutch Harbour for repairs. For 3 days the crew had such liberty as an Aleutians base afforded, then shoved off for Kiska. Admiral Theobald's cruisers conducted a heavy shelling of that island on the 8th of August, and Triton hoped to catch enemy ships trying to escape, but none did. During that month, Triton was mostly at sea, but targets were not plentiful, and she damaged only 1. She also carried Army reconnaissance troops from Dutch Harbour to Adak. Early in September 1942, the submarine was gratefully returned to Hawaiian sunshine. Another Kiska watchstander was Grunion, Lieutenant Commander Manat El Abel, a new fleet submarine which had arrived at Pearl Harbor in late June and had taken off for Aleutian patrol on the 30th. Between 15 and the 28th of July, she made 5 attacks on Japanese sub-chasers, sank 2 and badly damaged a third. On the 30th of July, she reported heavy anti-submarine activity at the entrance to Kiska and was ordered to report at Dutch Harbour, but Grunion never acknowledged and was never seen again. How and where she was lost still remains a mystery. Other fleet-type submarines in the North Pacific made no terminations during the summer of 1942, and the meagre results of these patrols prompted Admiral Nimitz to pull most of the big boats out of Theobald's bailiwick and send them to more profitable hunting grounds. During an October patrol by Halibut, an effort was made to employ aircraft in finding targets for her, but this was a new experience for both, and communications were not good enough. One plane gave Halibut an enemy ship position in latitude-longitude coordinates, which would have been fine except that the boat had been running so long in a dense fog that she had no idea where she was herself. On the 11th of October, Halibut was close enough to an enemy ship, apparently a freighter, to see a PBY making near misses. The submarine skipper decided to join in as the freighter, unescorted, was steaming in slow circles. During his surface approach, the Japanese crew started to swing out lifeboats, apparently in preparation for abandoning ship. Halibut fired 4 torpedoes, but all missed, at least one passing under the target. The submarine then received a nasty surprise in the shape of a torpedo from the freighter and several close shots from a concealed deck gun. Her target was a Q-ship, and Halibut was lucky to get out with a whole hull. All summer and fall, the plucky little S-boats continued their Arctic vigil, but S-31, Lieutenant Commander Robert F. Sellers, was the only one to sink anything, a 3,000-ton Maru on the 26th of October. The S-boat was patrolling the main route from the Kuriles to the Aleutians when she came upon the target anchored in the open road stead off Paramushiro, and punctured its hull with 2 well-aimed torpedoes. A minute later, S-31 grounded, and for the next half-hour scraped and bounced along the bottom of the bay, finally clearing the foul ground. Commander Sellers later observed, "There is no sensation quite like that obtained when twisting and turning, trying to stay at periscope depth, searching for a path through the reefs to deep water." But he added, "There is nothing like hearing torpedoes explode and a good sinking to keep the crew happy." S-31 cruised over 4,000 miles for this one termination, and like her sisters was mauled by monstrous seas. One man had cracked ribs, and 2 others were injured by waves over the bridge. Winter brought more grief for the S-boats, and the experience of S-35 was particularly chilly. Lieutenant Henry S. Monroe took this boat on a pre-Christmas patrol off Amchitka. An Arctic blow made up on the 21st of December, and the submarine crawled desperately up and down the steep slopes of pale green frigid waves which frequently inundated the tiny bridge. On the second dog watch, a wave slammed Monroe into a hatch, spraining an arm and a leg. He limped painfully below and turned in, only to be routed out by the dread shout of "Fire!" from the control room where salt water had short-circuited electric cables. Crackling white electric arcs and wicked blue flames lit up the control room. When one fire was quenched, another broke out. Noxious fumes forced the men to secure engines and drove them topside. The sailors worked desperately, as they were in imminent danger of grounding on Amchitka, but finally they put out the fires and restarted the engines. Next morning, fire broke out again, and since there was no flame-extinguishing chemical left, all hands were driven to the exposed bridge where they huddled miserably, praying that the fire would suffocate for want of air. All day the struggle continued, engineers alternating between smoky interior and icy topsides. Eventually, Monroe and his men won the fight and completed a slow passage to Adak. S-35 sailors were convinced that theirs was the toughest patrol of the war to date, and many another submariner would agree. On the 1st of April 1942, there was not much left of the old Asiatic fleet, but 6 old destroyers and Captain John Wilkes's submarines, then based at Fremantle, Australia. Even they were slowed down by shortages and by frequent demands for defensive and evacuation missions. Wilkes's force was now split. The S-boats were sent to base under General MacArthur at Brisbane in order to patrol the Australian mandates, while the fleet boats continued to overhaul at Fremantle or Albany and to patrol the Indies and the Philippines. At the same time, Wilkes was relieved of some of the area for which he was responsible by the assignment of Formosa, the East China Sea north of the Philippines and the Western Pacific as far as Palau, to Central Pacific submarines. The South Pacific, east of longitude 159 degrees, the meridian of Russell Island, became an orphan zone, where control of American submarines was vested in Nimitz or Halsey, but the boats to do the work were based at Brisbane. At the beginning of April, Wilkes had under his command 21 fleet boats and 5 S-boats. 3 replacement fleet boats and 6 S-boats were on their way out. The latter group, Subdiv 53, Lieutenant Commander E. Yeomans, took 45 days to reach Brisbane from Panama, arrived in mid-April and started patrolling only 6 days later. About the same time, the 5 S-boats from Fremantle arrived in Brisbane, and all 11 were organised as the Eastern Australia Submarine Group, TF-42, under the command of Rear Admiral Francis W. Rockwell, who was relieved the 12th of August by Captain Ralph W. Christie in Tender Griffin. Fremantle remained the headquarters and Captain Wilkes the commander of the fleet boats, TF-51. Patrols from Fremantle during April and May 1942 were neither spectacular nor profitable. Boats would make quick runs northward to pass through the narrow tide-swept Lombok Strait in darkness. Thence they would steer north or northeast to their patrol stations. As a rule, few sightings were made, and more often than not the boats would be ordered to evacuate Europeans or stranded American aviators from an enemy-occupied island. Sturgeon sank a small freighter en route to her station, and on the 3rd of April blew up a Japanese frigate. Her patrol was broken off in late April when she was sent in to Chilajap to pick up stranded British flyers, but an officer, Lieutenant Chester W. Nimitz Jr., who went ashore in this Japanese-held port, could not find them, and she returned to Fremantle the 7th of May after having been at sea 170 out of the previous 200 days. Spearfish had better luck off Western Luzon, sinking one 4,000-ton freighter and a week later one of 7,000 tons. Then she was pulled off patrol to evacuate Army and Navy nurses from Corregidor. Seawolf, on April Fool's Day, south of Java, mangled light cruiser Naka with hits in 2 fire rooms. Naka barely managed to make port and was out of the war a full year. Sea Raven performed a satisfactory rescue mission in mid-April, evacuating 33 Australians from Timor under trying conditions. Ensign George C. Cook USNR swam in through the surf, and after failing to find the Aussies, tried again 3 nights later and brought these debilitated men through the surf. Their gratitude was touching. Porpoise rescued 5 Army aviators from an island near Halmahera and received in return a case of Scotch whisky with General MacArthur's thanks. Lieutenant Commander Eugene B. McKinney took salmon up the Lombok, Makassar-Sulu route and on the morning of the 25th of May sighted smoke on the horizon, closed and sank the 11,000-ton repair ship Asahi. The Japanese never seemed to realize the menace of a smoking stack. A few days later, McKinney followed another such sign to the termination of 4,000 skipjack. Lieutenant Commander James W. Coe sailed via Timor and the Celebes and Sulu seas to Cam Bay, Indochina. On 6th May, she made a pre-dawn spurt to get ahead of a 2,500-ton freighter and sank her before sunrise. Later, the same day, she missed a French passenger ship with 2 prematures, but on the 8th, 2 of her torpedoes crumpled a 4,800-ton Maru and damaged a companion freighter. The escorting destroyer worked over skipjack with 39 depth charges but did no damage. A few days later, Red Coe saw the wake of one of his torpedoes pass directly under a fat transport. A bitter dose, as he reported. I now have little confidence in these torpedoes. On 16th May, the same thing happened. Even the sinking next day of 5,500-ton Tazan Maru, while her white-clad crew scrambled into lifeboats, failed to allay the skipper's wrath. On tying up in Fremantle, he wrote, "To make round trips of 8,500 miles into enemy waters, to gain attack positions undetected within 800 yards of enemy ships, only to find that torpedoes run deep, and over half the time will fail to function, seems to me an undesirable manner of gaining information, which might be determined any morning within a few miles of a torpedo station in the presence of comparatively few hazards. Coe's pungent remark was not the first intimation of disgust with torpedoes in the Southwest Pacific. As far back as December 1941, Lieutenant Commander T.D. Jacobs, CO of Sargo, had experimented with shallow depth settings and had inactivated the magnetic influence device, hoping to account for the failure of 13 torpedoes to explode. Jacobs later requested test firing to check depth control. Complaints to the Bureau of Ordnance brought an equivocal reply in February 1942 that the torpedoes ran 4 feet deeper than the setting only during the first half-mile of their run. Submarine crews were losing confidence in their captains, and the captains were losing confidence in their torpedoes and themselves. On 21 June, Captain Fife, of the Southwest Pacific Command, took matters into his own hands and caused torpedoes to be fired, under his personal supervision, against a special fisherman's net target. Exercise heads were specially weighted to simulate a standard warhead, the results proving that torpedoes ran about 10 feet deeper than set. In July, the test was repeated with the same damnably conclusive results. Admiral King now directed the Bureau of Ordnance to recheck its data. Finally, on 1 August 1942, 8 months after the war's start, word was passed to the fleet that torpedoes were actually running 10 feet too deep. There still remained the premature explosions and contact firing in failures to be dealt with, and no remedy was found during the period which we are now discussing. So we must bear in mind that in all attacks described in this volume, the American submariner was a gladiator without his cestus. Torpedoes were both unreliable and in short stock. Many were abandoned in the Philippines. Stateside production and overseas distribution were barely able to keep pace with expenditure. This had 2 bad effects. Patrols made with less than full torpedo allowance were cut short by running out of fish, and frequently a target escaped because the submarine could afford to fire only 1 or 2 torpedoes where a full spread should have been used. Swordfish, in May and June 1942, swept through the South China Sea, sank 2 ships and damaged 1. When ordered over to the Malay Peninsula, she located the spot where lay the bones of His Majesty's ship Prince of Wales and Repulse, and ascertained that the Japanese had marked it with a buoy. Returning to Fremantle on 4th July, the skipper complained that his men had not been separated from the ship in 8 months, and made a modest request that 36-hour liberties be granted to a portion of his crew. Not long after this, an elaborate recreation and relief system was established in Australia as at Pearl Harbor. There were seaside and inland resort hotels where pallid submariners could tan themselves on the beach or go on kangaroo hunts. And, as one of their number remarked, "We enjoyed going ashore there because there were women, plenty of them, and they spoke English." On 26 May 1942, when Rear Admiral Lockwood relieved Captain Wilkes as Commander Southwest Pacific Submarines, Japanese pressure in the Solomons and New Guinea brought a gradual shifting of fleet boats from Western to Eastern Australia. Throughout the summer and fall, Lockwood sent occasional patrols into the South China Sea, Philippine waters, and the Flores Sea. There were a few successes, such as the blasting of a big aircraft ferry. Coasting on the surface during a violent electrical storm on 11th September, Saury put 3 torpedoes into this vessel, sending planes, men, and fragments of ship sky high. Lieutenant Commander Frederick B. Warder took Seawolf into Philippine waters on her 7th war patrol, and he was very angry and looking aggressively for revenge. On his 5th patrol, he had been plagued by enemy escorts and had sunk only 1 ship, a converted gunboat. On his 6th patrol, although firing 17 torpedoes at a variety of targets, he had sunk only 2 medium Maras. This 7th patrol he was determined to get the enemy if it meant going right into the harbour after him, and that is just what he did. On the 2nd of November, at the entrance to Davao Gulf, he fired 3 stern shots at Gifu Maru, 2933 tons, took a photo of her sinking, counted 41 survivors in the water, and cut in his position less than 5 miles from a lighthouse. The next day he charged into Davao Harbour, watched men loading hemp on board the 7,189-ton Sagami Maru, lined her up in his periscope sights and put a fish through the starboard side of her engine room. The crew fought back with deck guns, but Warder calmly put a second shot into her starboard side aft. This took all the fight out of the Japanese, who manned boats and rowed for the dock 800 yards away. A third torpedo, adroitly placed in the bow, sent this big ship to the bottom, and Seawolf hauled clear, furiously pursued by patrol craft and planes. Warder did not abandon Davao Gulf, and on the 8th polished off converted gunboat Keiko Maru in 3 deliberate hitting attacks which the victim's disciplined and alerted crew were unable to fight off. Exploits such as these were too few to break Japan's rice line between the Indies and the Empire. The most valuable accomplishments of the Australia-based boats were in the enemy-infested waters of the Bismarcks, the Solomons and New Guinea. During the spring and early summer of 1942, the brunt of submarine war in that area was borne in discomfort and danger by the venerable S-boats. In theory, this was an excellent employment for craft of limited endurance, but practice soon uncovered their defects. On the surface, the S-boat could do but 11 knots, nowhere near enough to make approaches on warships. If a target obligingly came within range of a waiting S-boat, primitive methods of torpedo control prevented accurate shooting. After getting off her fish, the S-boat could go under water neither as deep nor as far nor as fast as the fleet boats, and her riveted hull frequently leaked a revealing trail of oil. Machinery and men were soon worn out by cruising in tropical waters with no air conditioning. Nevertheless, these boats made a wonderful record. Lieutenant Commander Oliver G. Kirk took S-42 up to the Bismarck archipelago, and on the 11th of May fired 4 torpedoes at minelayer Okinoshima, flagship of the Japanese Tulagi occupation group. He saw 3 hits, like long, thin, horizontal phosphorescent bands, start fatal fires amidships. The ensuing counterattack brought everyone to the point of heat exhaustion. One man threw a fit, others collapsed in their tracks when the strain was over. S-47, Lieutenant Commander James W. Davis in the same waters had trouble from start to finish. She could not move fast enough to get in a shot at a cruiser, whose escort's depth charges shook her like a kitten in a dog's mouth. She missed a freighter, which turned and nearly rammed her. Machinery breakdowns were frequent and difficult to repair. Living conditions were intolerable. Mildew whiskers grew on food and clothing, rust attacked metal, heat rash broke out on irritated skins. Men slept on the slimy steel decks rather than in their sweat-soaked bunks. In the hope that the crew might have more rest during the submerged hours of daylight, meals were upended, with breakfast at nightfall, dinner at midnight, and supper at dawn. S-44, equipped with air conditioning, found life more bearable and sank converted salvage ship Shuei Maru on the 12th of May off Cape St. George. Navigating an S-boat was accomplished more by smell and feel than through science. There was no radar, no fathometer, and only inferior sound gear. Submergence all day in unpredictable currents threw off dead reckoning, and without bubble sextant star fixes could not be obtained at night. Even their horizon sextants were almost worn out, so that twilight fixes were uncertain. On the night of 13, the 14th of August, S-39, Lieutenant F.E. Brown, grounded on a submerged reef off Rossel Island in the Louisiades, listed 35 degrees to port and commenced pounding to pieces on the rocks. Backing with the engines, blowing ballast and fuel, discharging torpedoes and jettisoning ammunition had little effect. As the day wore on, the list increased to 60 degrees, and there was danger that the boat would roll completely over. Fortunately, the Australian corvette Katoomba appeared and rescued all hands, leaving S-39 to be destroyed by Allied bombers. In spite of all their difficulties, the Brisbane-based S-boats helped to reduce the Emperor's merchant marine, and during the Guadalcanal campaign they won some outstanding duels. On the 8th of August, S-38, Lieutenant Commander H.G. Munson disposed of transport Mayo Maru, loaded with reinforcements for Guadalcanal. 2 days later, S-44, Lieutenant Commander J.R. Moore, sank heavy cruiser Kako, retiring after the Savo Island battle. In October 1942, the S-boats were sent stateside and underwater patrols in these waters were turned over to fleet boats from the Aleutians, under the direct control of Admiral Halsey, Commander South Pacific Force. As the boats, for tactical reasons, had to be based at Brisbane, Captain Leon J. Huffman, a submariner, was assigned to Halsey's staff as liaison officer. Frequently, during the darker days of the campaign, Huffman's tally of underwater victories was the only good news the Admiral got. Let us try to see this campaign through the eyes of the submarine skipper, for whom each patrol was an operation in itself. Sculpin, Lieutenant Commander Lucius H. Chappell of the old Asiatic Fleet, was one of the first fleet subs to take station off New Britain. Early in the morning of the 28th of September, she possibly damaged a tanker, but then found out that she was up against the Japanese varsity. For hours, two well-coordinated destroyers tossed depth charges down on her, tearing a small hole in the pressure hull which had the crew sweating and bailing, but did not force them to break off their patrol. On the 7th of October, Chappell saw a destroyer and a transport in his periscope, and was tempted to retaliate on the destroyer, but prudence prevailed over personal animosity, and his torpedoes sank the 4,700-ton transport. After the usual depth-charge chivotee, Sculpin swam clear. On the night of the 10th of October, Chappell and his watch topside were able to applaud an air raid on Kavieng, then moved down to Rabaul, where they witnessed the same thing on the 13th. Next day, Sculpin started some fireworks of her own, making a surface chase to sink a 3,000-ton passenger cargo Maru. On the 18th, the sub was routed into New Georgia Strait, where she tussled with a ship which had started life as a tramp, but now had guns and depth charges to defend herself. Sculpin missed this one with her last torpedo, and then went back to the barn at Brisbane. In October, our old friend Gudgeon, 13 days out of Brisbane, sighted a rusty 5-ship convoy south of New Ireland, pounding painfully along. Lying in wait on the convoy's starboard bow, she fired torpedoes at the two leading ships, which were in line abreast, then dove and headed underneath the others so as to blend her propeller noises with theirs. Even so, the two escorts located and attacked her with 51 depth charges. One of the targets, a 6,800-tonner, sank, and the other was probably damaged. Sturgeon, on a 7-week patrol along the seaway between Rabaul and the Short Lands, made contact with 36 targets, many of them big and juicy, but moving at terrifically high speed. Warships on this Tokyo Express run were hard to catch, and Sturgeon managed to sink only the 8,000-ton aircraft ferry Katsuragi Maru. Silversides parted from her tender in Brisbane with the executive officer tootling on his trombone and the crew softly humming the favourite Australian melody, Waltzing Matilda. This was her 4th war patrol, and she was a good boat and a lucky one. On the 23rd of December off Bougainville, a fireman named Platter came down with a terrible bellyache, which the doctor, pharmacist's mate T. Moore, diagnosed as appendicitis. Lieutenant Commander Burlingame consented to let Moore operate when it became apparent that the man would die if something were not done in a hurry. A chief radio man was called to lend a hand, and 2 husky seamen held the patient on the wardroom table. The boat submerged to 20 fathoms and the operation began. There were difficulties in finding the appendix, keeping the man drugged and preventing the operating crew from passing out from the ether. But after 5 hours' work, Platter was sewed up shipshape and stowed in his bunk. Silversides surfaced just in time to avoid a collision with an enemy destroyer. Her batteries were nearly depleted, but she submerged again, and Burlingame played tag with the destroyer while a Japanese plane came over and dropped a salvo of explosives close by his exposed periscope, knocking it off and locking the bow planes so that the boat started upend. Everyone on board lost footing and the patient was thrown from his bunk. An ensign ran forward to ask the chief torpedo man what he was doing about the bow planes. The chief replied that he was doing all he could. He was praying. Prayers were effective, and Silversides eventually squared away on an even keel and evaded pursuit. In recompense for this rugged bout, Silversides sank a 10,000-ton tanker on the 18th of January 1943, and 2 days later sank 3 freighters, totaling 18,000 tons with 6 torpedoes, and the patient recovered and returned to duty. Nautilus, the submarine hero of Midway, had an experience on New Year's Day 1943 in keeping with the Jules Verne tradition. She hove to off a Bougainville beach and took on board a refugee group consisting of 14 Catholic nuns, 3 children and 12 other persons, whom Skipper Brockman greeted with "Happy New Year," as indeed it was for them. Nautilus entertained these guests until they could be transferred to a patrol craft in friendly waters. Albacore, Lieutenant Commander Richard C. Lake, made a significant termination without realizing it. After dark, the 18th of December, she was cruising off Madang Harbour, New Guinea, when the skipper unleashed 2 torpedoes at what he thought was a cargo ship. Countermeasures kept him down, but in the morning he saw large quantities of debris marked with Japanese characters. He returned to base claiming a freighter. Actually, he had sunk a victor of the Wake and Savo Island battles, light cruiser Tenryu. Not all the boats were lucky. Growler, Lieutenant Commander Howard W. Gilmore, put out from Brisbane for the Bismarcks in January 1943, and on the 16th made a brilliant attack on a well-escorted 6,000-ton freighter, sending her down with 2 torpedoes. After several other scrapes with enemy ships, Growler on the night of the 7th of February was suddenly attacked, on the surface, by a Japanese destroyer at very close range. Before Gilmore could turn her, he inadvertently rammed the enemy at 17 knots. The boat shuddered and heeled 50 degrees while enemy machine gunners poured a shattering fusillade onto the exposed superstructure. Gilmore, badly wounded, ordered the bridge cleared and shouted, "Take her down!" Growler submerged with the skipper and 2 others still on deck. She was saved by this unselfish action, which cost brave Gilmore his life. Argonaut, the big 2,700-tonner which in August transported Marine raiders to Makin Island, was sent on a routine patrol in January 1943. On the 10th, in full view of an American Army bomber, she attacked an enemy convoy and damaged 1 destroyer. The other destroyers attacked with depth charges, damaging Argonaut so that her bow came up like a giant buoy. The Japanese then circled and pumped shells into the hull until they had destroyed it. Lieutenant Commander John R. Pierce and his entire crew of 103 perished. It is surprising that more submarines were not lost in the Solomons, New Guinea campaigns. Enemy transports seldom travelled unescorted, the escorts were usually well trained, and the oily calm prevalent in those low latitudes made a periscope easy to detect. There were plenty of enemy airfields on which to base anti-submarine aircraft, and Japanese submarines offered another threat. Finally, American flyers regarded all submarines in these waters as hostile and frequently dropped explosives on American boats. Such hazards kept our submarines from running up high scores. In the 6 months of the Guadalcanal campaign, their total bag was 23 ships and 85,361 tons. In October and November 1942, mine-laying by submarines began in the southwest, as in the Central Pacific. Thresher, Gar, Tautog, and Grenadier made successful plants far into enemy waters, even in the Gulf of Siam. In post-war tabulation, Tautog's mines received credit for blasting 3 ships, and Grenadier's for 2. During the Solomons New Guinea campaign, there had been little or no contact with the Philippine guerrilla forces, but in January 1943, Gudgeon landed 6 men and a ton of supplies on Negroes. Thenceforth, submarine runs were made about every 5 weeks, doing much to hearten and support the Filipino patriots. Compared with their later successes, the performance of American submarines in the first year of the war was disappointing. Certain factors that kept that performance down have appeared in the stories of war patrols, but the reasons for these defects are not so apparent. Particularly does the question, why did the Navy enter the war with faulty torpedoes, cry for an answer. Japanese torpedoes were wickedly effective, and certainly the Japanese were not superior to Americans in technical know-how. Why, then, this difference? The answer is not simple. In pre-war days, torpedo development, manufacture and testing were lodged in one place, the Naval Torpedo Station, a large establishment on Goat Island in the harbour of Newport, Rhode Island. But the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance directly supervised the torpedo station, and so cannot escape responsibility. There was no direct link between the station and the fleet, and only tenuous liaison was maintained by line officers, skilled in torpedo engineering, who rotated between sea billets and the torpedo station. These few officers were almost the only ones in the Navy whose technical knowledge of torpedoes exceeded what was required for normal overhaul and practice firings. The submariner's weapon was designed, built, and tested under the direction of specialists. The ultimate consumer was allowed no say in the matter. The situation would not have been so bad except for the policy of top secrecy maintained by the Bureau of Ordnance. For instance, when the magnetic influence exploder was designed and tested, knowledge of its mechanism, even of its existence, was bottled up and sealed in the minds of a few men for 16 years. It was finally issued to the fleet in 1941 with an injunction that captains and torpedo officers keep it ultra-secret. Later, torpedo men were reluctantly given some details so that at least they would know how to handle the device. Service experience with the exploder was practically nil when war started. Men on the firing line were largely ignorant of its functioning. Pre-war economy was another factor that made for poor performance. A torpedo is an expensive weapon, costing between $8,000 and $10,000 in 1941, and the Navy was governed by a budget before the fighting started. Only a handful of men in service had ever seen a live warhead fired. In practice, a special exercise head was fitted which caused the torpedo to float at the end of its run in order to facilitate recovery. When a firing drill was conducted, officers and men were interested only in making the costly torpedo run under the target and having it surface for recovery afterwards. If the torpedo ran under the target's keel, it was presumed to be a hit. The magnetic influence exploder was never given a chance to explode, and nobody questioned but that it would function. And nobody found out that the torpedoes were running much deeper than they were set. The torpedo station tested them against a fishnet mounted on the Newport Range between Coasters Harbour and Gould Islands, where the water was too shoal for deep running. Depth recording mechanisms, installed within the body of the torpedo, indicated promptly when its depth changed, but were unreliable in measuring the depth. Besides, it was assumed that, with the influence exploder, it would make no difference if the depth were a few feet off one way or the other. As for the contact firing mechanism, hundreds of practice shots were fired with the torpedo swinging from a pendulum against a plate representing a ship's side, and torpedo drops were made against a concrete ramp. But these tests were evidently inadequate as the most important defect was never disclosed. There is some consolation in learning that the Germans, with all their previous torpedo experience, had much the same sort of trouble with magnetic influence exploders in this war, but the Germans solved their problem much more quickly than did the Americans. And it is humiliating to think that poor have-not Japan liberally expended live torpedoes and hulls in realistic tests, which rich America felt she could not afford. It is only fair to say that the torpedo took more than its share of blame. That misses caused by errors of judgment were sometimes improperly ascribed to torpedo faults. Blunders were made by submariners in approaching targets, in firing spreads and in control, owing to lack of combat experience. Torpedo maintenance was occasionally neglected, and duds due to careless upkeep were blamed on the mechanism. But the torpedoes were defective, and nothing is more disastrous to military morale than faulty weapons. It is a matter of pride that the submariners of the Pacific Fleet never gave up trying, and were eventually rewarded when the defects of their torpedoes were corrected. The torpedo shortage of 1942, which reduced spreads and shortened patrols, was caused partly by the loss of 233 torpedoes at Cavite and partly by American politics. As early as 1930, the Bureau of Ordnance had foreseen a torpedo shortage in the event of war, and endeavoured to reopen a World War I torpedo station at Alexandria, Virginia. Civilian employees of the Newport plant saw in this a threat to their jobs, and as the torpedo station was regarded by certain politicians as a part of their patronage, they successfully prevented the re-establishment of the Alexandria torpedo station until July 1941. The year was one of exploration rather than exploitation. Submarines probed everywhere to feel out the principal Japanese shipping lanes, and much of this search was unproductive. For instance, submarines patrolled fruitlessly off certain passages into the Palaus for months, until, in October 1942, a captured chart revealed that the Japanese were routing traffic into and out of that group of islands by a secret passage many miles away from the patrol route. Excessive caution was another deterrent to success. This was partly the fault of a convention in pre-war target practice which imposed severe penalties on a submarine that was sighted before firing. Early in the war, American submarines stayed submerged all day, often waited for targets to appear instead of seeking them out, fired from extreme ranges, dove deep at the slightest sign of countermeasures. Night attacks on the surface, penetration of enemy harbours, counterattack on escorts, all normal procedures in years to come were daring innovations in this exploratory year. In addition to tactical improvements, future submariners were to have the advantage of technological advances such as radar, and as more boats were completed and more bases were wrested from the enemy, the number of patrols vastly increased. On the bright side, there were many happy discoveries in 1942. Shipbuilders had done even better than they knew. Submarine hulls withstood pressures and pummelings far beyond anticipated limits. Before the war, the Portsmouth Navy Yard tested hull strength by actually depth-charging submarines, even with crews inside, and from these tests made important improvements. The engines were rugged and reliable. The boats were long-winded and far-ranging. Even prosaic details such as the Kleinschmidt water distiller added immeasurably to comfort and human endurance in American submarines. On the other side, Japanese anti-submarine technique was poor initially and improved little during the war. From the 7th of December 1941 to the 8th of February 1943, only 5 American submarines were lost in action, and one of these was lying alongside a dock. By February 1943, the best hunting grounds were known, some of the torpedo defects had been corrected, and there were plenty of aggressive skippers who could be depended on to make the most of opportunities. The most ambitious of the many special missions assigned to the submarines occurred as an offstage act of the Guadalcanal-Tulagi landings, a scheme to distract Japanese attention during the early days of the Solomons campaign. It involved transporting a raiding force over some 2,000 miles of ocean to Makin, one of the Gilbert Islands. Selected to do the job were the big 2,700-ton Nautilus and Argonaut. The passengers were 222 Marines of the 2nd Raider Battalion commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Evans F. Carlson, USMC. Early in the war, the Japanese moved into the Gilbert Islands and announced to reluctant natives that henceforth Hirohito was their boss, but they did little to implement the pronouncement. On Makin Atoll, for instance, the entire garrison consisted of 43 fighting men. Admiral Nimitz was well aware of the enemy's weakness in the Gilberts and believed that a small force of Marines could stir up a rumpus out of all proportion to their numbers. He was right, but the rumpus was not to our ultimate advantage. Events were happening so fast in the Pacific that there was little time to plan and still less to train the expedition. On the 8th of August, the 2 submarines poked their black noses out of Pearl Harbor, separated, and settled down for a long and uncomfortable voyage. There was no place to sit and no place to stand, so the Marines and off-watch sailors kept to their bunks except when eating. The air was hot and fetid with the odour of unwashed bodies. Meals were a continuous performance for the cooks and stewards, since it took 3 hours to feed all hands. The only breaks were the morning and evening exercise periods, but even these were trying since the appearance of an enemy ship, sub or plane, meant a pell-mell scramble for the hatches before submerging. That sort of thing went on for over a week, yet the sailors and raiders managed to retain their good spirits. Nautilus, carrying Commander John M. Haynes, the task force commander, arrived off Makin Atoll before dawn the 16th of August and spent the day sizing up the island through her periscope. That night, the 2 boats joined company and final orders were given. During the mid-watch, the submarines inched cautiously toward the beach, a ticklish navigational problem with inaccurate charts and current tables. Rubber boats were brought topside, inflated, rigged with outboard motors and stowed with the raiders' gear. The next problem was getting the boats into the water and the men into the boats. The first was easy, but the second required that some of the Nautilus Marines ride in Argonaut boats. Nautilus wallowed noisily in the swell like a playful hippopotamus, water sloshing and wheezing through the limber holes in the superstructure. From the beach came a steady roar of surf lashing against the reef. With all this noise, Colonel Carlson was unable to make his orders heard, and was very nearly left behind. Not knowing whether his men were in the proper boats, he decided to make the landing in one spot instead of 2 as planned, but one boat didn't get the word. Makin is a typical Pacific atoll, a necklace of palm-shaded coral islets around a quiet lagoon. On the seaward side of Butaritari, the largest island, is a fringing coral reef. Carlson elected to land over the reef opposite the principal settlement, which lay on the lagoon only 1,500 feet across Butaritari. The rubber boats skimmed through the surf and made their landings undetected, 15 of them hitting the correct spot at 5, August 17th, 3 others landing somewhat to the north, the one which hadn't got the word beached a full mile to the south. Carlson paused long enough to hide boats in the underbrush, post a guard and establish radio communication with the submarines. So far so good. Now prospects for surprise, as rosy as the dawn light which was streaking the eastern sky, were suddenly shattered by a rifle shot. A Marine had accidentally discharged his piece. So, abandoning all pretense of secrecy, Carlson ordered one company of raiders to dash across the narrow island and seize the coastal road on the lagoon side. The rifle shot was not a complete surprise to Sergeant Major Kanemitsu and his men. Several days previously, the Japanese High Command, uneasily aware that the Americans were on the move and not knowing whither, had ordered a general alert. Makin was a soft billet for the Japanese, situated as it was in the pleasant flow of the trade winds and far from the shooting war, but Kanemitsu had taken the alert seriously. Each day his little garrison held manoeuvres. Machine gun nests were built, and tree-climbing snipers were ready to station themselves in the tops of coconut palms. Hence, although the warning came before réveillé, the Japanese were quick to organize defenses. Not quick enough, however. Lieutenant Merwin C. Plumley and his company reached the lagoon shore, took over a building without opposition, then commenced a southward advance. It was 6:30 before the Japanese, arriving afoot, on bicycles and in trucks, made their first effort to stop the Marines. For the rest of the day, the Japanese were to fight with last-ditch bravery. Eager natives joined the Marines early and told Carlson that the bulk of the enemy lay 2 miles to the southward, congregated around a radio station at the head of a wharf. Carlson asked for and received artillery support from Nautilus, but Argonaut did not receive the message. The submarine opened heavy fire on the land positions to the best of its ability, although handicapped by poor observation and lack of shooting-type shells. While the shooting went on, the Marines reported a small transport and a patrol boat in the lagoon standing down from the northward. Nautilus gunners could not see these targets but scattered 23 salvos from the 2 6-inch guns in their direction. The results were surprising. Both craft sank and 60 Japanese went down with the transport. At 9:05, Kanemitsu admitted the hopelessness of his situation with a final radio message, "All men are dying serenely in battle." That was hardly the phrase for it. From the tops of the coconut trees they sniped at every raider that moved, especially those who appeared to be wearing telephones or operating radios. From their machine gun emplacements they fired until all the gunners were terminated. Carlson found it necessary to employ his second company when the southward advance slowed down. At 10:39, an enemy reconnaissance plane appeared and the 2 submarines went under. This was forerunner of several aerial attacks, the first at 11:30 when 2 planes dropped explosives harmlessly, and the second at 12:55 when 12 planes of motley description flew into the fight. 10 of these shelled and strafed the island without success, while 2 others, big Mavis flying boats, landed troops in the lagoon. Marine automatic weapon fire hit and burned one plane on the water and caused the other to crash in, taking off. Even so, about 35 troops made the shore in Japanese territory. By mid-afternoon, snipers concealed in the palm groves became so difficult to locate that Carlson pulled his men north into more open terrain, hoping that the enemy would give chase and be easier targets. As the Japanese fell for this ruse, another heavy shelling raid came over and dropped explosives right on them. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Oscar F. Petros, USMC, and 11 men from the boat, which had landed far to the south, found themselves to the enemy's rear. They immediately went on a destructive rampage, destroyed the radio station, terminated Japanese, searched houses, and burned equipment. That evening, Petros and 7 men breasted the surf and reached their submarine. At 17, Carlson began a deliberate withdrawal to the embarkation point and at 19 launched his boats. But the surf, which had been so easy on the way in, was a different story on the way out. Outboard motors declined to work, and no matter how hard the men paddled, few could clear the breakers. Boats capsized, men lost their weapons and most of their clothing, and finally were cast up on the beach exhausted. Only 7 boats, and fewer than 100 men made it back to the submarines that night. This was low tide for marine spirits. Here were 120 of them on a hostile shore deep in enemy waters without sufficient arms and hampered by wounded, 4 of them stretcher cases. The only light in the sky was a cheering signal blinker from the submarines, to the effect that they would stay indefinitely to make the rescue. During the night there was but one brief skirmish with a Japanese patrol, and in the morning a new effort was made to get off. Carlson sent Major James Roosevelt, USMCR, his executive officer, out through the surf with 4 boats. In the meantime, a volunteer 5-man marine crew headed into the shore from Nautilus, hoping to get a line through the surf and pull the remaining boats out to sea. One swam ashore, but a plane strafed the boat, which disappeared and was never seen again. There were still 70 men left on Makin, but Japanese aircraft became so active that it was decided to postpone further embarkation efforts until nightfall. Apparently these raiders thought they had been abandoned on Makin. In a popular Japanese history that came out during the war, there is published in facsimile a note signed by a Marine captain offering to surrender his unit of approximately 60 men. Fortunately, when they were looking around for someone to receive the note, these Marines made the surprising discovery that there were no Japanese left. Most of them were deceased. A few had fled to remote islets of the atoll. The situation was indeed well in hand. During the remainder of the 18th, the raiders wandered about, picking up important documents in Kanemitsu's headquarters and destroying weapons and equipment. 83 dead Japanese were counted, and only 3 live ones, who soon joined the majority. After dark, 4 rubber boats were carried across the island to the quiet waters of the lagoon, lashed to a native outrigger canoe, and before midnight had reached the submarines. Flames from burning Japanese aviation gasoline made a beacon as the 2 undersea boats departed for Pearl Harbor, convinced that all living Marines were on board. But 9 of them were left behind. At the time, it looked as if this foray were a great success, at a cost of 30 Marines martyred and missing. It caused the enemy to divert forces, secured interesting intelligence, and taught valuable lessons about raiding islands and about submarine troop transport. Nevertheless, this raid prompted Tokyo to order the fortification of the Gilbert Islands on a scale which later cost the Americans dear. Within a month of Carlson's departure, a detachment of Japanese Special Naval Landing Force landed on Tarawa. More troops followed, so that by November 1943, when the Marines stormed ashore, over 2,500 well-entrenched Japanese were on hand to meet them, a striking contrast to Kanemitsu's 43-man garrison at Makin. The story of 9 missing Marines provides a sad sequel. Left behind in the rush, they were captured a few days later and shipped to Kwajalein for transportation to Tokyo. At Kwajalein, the prisoners received good care at the hands of curious Japanese, who frequently gave them candy and cigarettes and joshed with them about the sights they would see in Tokyo. For 6 weeks the raiders lived there in barracks, never doubting the good faith of their captors. But early in October, Vice Admiral Koso Abe, commanding Marshall Island bases, became impatient over the delay in moving them out, and after a brief conference with an officer from Truk headquarters, summarily ordered the men executed. The onerous task fell on the shoulders of Captain Yoshio Obara, Kwajalein garrison commander. Obara, who had 2 brothers in America and nephews in the United States Army, protested vehemently against the inhuman and illegal order, but Abe remained adamant. The captain was unable to find a single volunteer executioner and at last detailed 4 officers, who reluctantly obeyed. Dubious homage was accorded the doomed men when Captain Obara selected a date for the execution which coincided with Japan's annual memorial to departed heroes, the Yasukuni Shrine Festival.